So I'm Christin Shepard. I'm the floodplain manager at Mile High Flood District, like Jonah said. That means that I process the CLOMR and LOMR applications. Those are map revisions or adjustments to the SFHA, or the Special Flood Hazard Area, also known as the 100-year floodplain. Does anyone not know the 100-year floodplain? You're in the wrong room at the wrong symposium, if so. So I'm curious by nature. I grew up asking a lot of questions. I was blessed also with a small child that asked a lot of questions, which has made me call my own mother and father very frequently and just say, thank you, because it takes a lot of patience to answer those questions. So lately, the question I've been asking myself is about this 100-year floodplain. Like I said, I spend a lot of time in these maps looking at these lines, and lately been wondering, just what is this thing? And why do we have it? And where did it come from? And why is it the 100-year floodplain and not the 400-year floodplain? See a lot of questions. Thanks, Mom and Dad. So Drew talked a lot about the data and the science and the climate and all that cool stuff. I'm going to tell you a story. This is the story of our floodplain management story that started over 150 years ago. So we're going to talk about how we got to where we are with floodplain management, what's going on right now with some of the changes, and then what we can kind of anticipate and look forward to. So our floodplain management story starts in the late 1800s. In the late 1800s, people were flocking to the rivers. There was industry, there was transportation, there was jobs, there was land. And, oh, I'm sorry. Try not to touch my mic thing. And the floodplain management approach at the time was a levee-only approach. So people were moving to the rivers. The floodplain management style was to do levees only. It's like there was a bunch of big rivers, and people looked at it and said, you know what would be great here is an earth wall. Let's put some of those in. So they built those up. Many neighborhoods cropped up next to the levees. And then many neighborhoods, particularly black communities, were forced into labor to build some of these levees and also shore them up, to build up and shore up the levees that were meant to protect them. So people are moving to the rivers, levees are being built up. I keep losing my place, and I apologize, because it's so lovely to see all your faces out there, but this is something else. Okay, thank you. Okay, levees. The levees are being built up, and over the decades, the levees start to fail. So in 1913, the Ohio River Valley flood, 415 people die. It causes $3 billion in today's dollars of damages. In 1927, the Mississippi River floods, 500 people die. That's actually presumed to be a gross underestimation. They think it's more in the thousands due to the black sharecroppers that lived right next to those levees and died and were washed away without ever being counted. Mississippi River flood cost $17 billion in today's damages. 700,000 people are homeless. 325,000 people are in refugee camps. There's no FEMA at the time, so we have Red Cross. This is a picture of a Red Cross refugee camp where people had to live for a number of years until they could move back to their homes or rebuild. So our floodplain management system is starting to take shape at this time. The levees are starting to fail. There's extensive damage. Some of the levees are built up over time, and like Dave's going to talk about later, the Mississippi levee just went bigger. But in general, the floodplain management community decided to pivot more away from those levees and look at other methods of floodplain management. Our system starts to look like this. The state and different organizations are part of the post-disaster response. There's no building regulations because no hazard has been delineated. So there's no one to say, do or don't build here. And if you do build here and there's a hazard, here's how you do it in a way that you can bounce back faster. Like I said, the pre-disaster mitigation is pivoting away from levees. And this is also the moment in 1929 when private flood insurance pulls out of the market. I always thought this happened later in the 80s, but it was actually on the heels of all these levees failing and this extensive damage, and by the way, just on the eve of the Great Depression. So flood insurance can't cover it anymore, and they pull out of the market. We move forward about 22 years. We move through the Great Depression, a couple world wars, yada, yada, yada. We get to 1951, Kansas, Missouri flood. This is a $12 billion in today's dollars damages. And the flooding extends past state lines. So it goes from Kansas to Missouri, as far east as Manhattan. President Truman is the sitting president at the time, and he's from Kansas City, Missouri. So this really hits home for him. And he is also working on a couple of, he has some pretty significant events happening. He's got vets coming back from World War II. He's got a housing boom, and he's trying to make an economy of peace. He's trying to get stability and predictability in the economy. So he recommends a national system of flood disaster insurance. He calls flood insurance the major gap between people having secure homes and secure communities. So he takes that 1929 system and he says, let's put flood insurance back on the market, but let's make it federal and let's make it subsidized. So he gets a bunch of initiatives started. He gets some people on the task force figuring out how do we have flood insurance for people that need it, and how do we determine a hazard? There's a bunch of questions that need figured out. It takes 17 years to do this, yada, yada, yada. We move into 1968. The National Flood Insurance Program is established. The National Flood Insurance Program used that time to analyze what would be best. They needed a demarcation line. They really needed to know who was going to pay and who wasn't going to pay, and how do we determine how much they pay. And so they settled on the 100-year floodplain line. They picked the 100-year floodplain line because they said it was a fair balance between protecting the public and overly stringent regulation. So, protecting the public, this is the late 1960s, based on the storm and climate data at the time, using the 100-year storm event for what that meant in the late 1960s. And overly stringent regulation, meaning helping and allowing people to build and develop. Because remember, this all started in the Truman era when he was really focused on getting homes built. So there's a development potential here. The NFIP and the insurance at this time is not mandatory. So in the very first year, 4 people sign up. Woo! Yeah. The second year, 87,000 people sign up. This is nationally, so that's less than the size of the city of Boulder. That's how many people sign up. The point is, it is slow and it is subsidized, and people aren't jumping onto this bandwagon. Meanwhile, other disasters are happening. 1969 Hurricane Camille is the strongest storm to make landfall, with storm surges up to 24 and 25 feet. In 1972, Hurricane Agnes has billions of dollars in damage. It's the most expensive storm to date. The sitting president at this time is now Richard Nixon, who's dealing with a lot internationally and domestically, and he's taking more of an offense approach. So he's like, how do we get ahead of this stuff? How do we prevent it from even happening? How do we mitigate ahead of time so that we're not having to respond with so much money to these disasters? So in 1973, he signs into law the NFIP becoming mandatory. So at this point now, if you're in the 100-year floodplain, you have to pay flood insurance. And if you're in the 100-year floodplain, you have to build to the building regulations if you're in those NFIP communities. Sorry. So now our system looks like this. Building regulations are now enforced and mandatory within the 100-year floodplain line. And the pre-disaster mitigation is now more about grants. So Nixon has disaster relief acts, but he's also focused on prevention. He wants to pour money into preventing these things from happening in the first place. And all of this system in 1973 is tied together with the 100-year floodplain line. So now we have this line, and it's revolutionary, by the way. In the 70s, it hadn't been done before. There was no line that showed people what hazard was. It gave communities the opportunity to make policy framework, and it gave building builders the opportunity to build smart and help Americans bounce back faster when these floods happened. So there's some good things about this line. And then there's some not so good things about this line. But what it is and what it isn't, it is the 100-year floodplain, the 100-year storm event. But it's just one storm event at one moment in time. It does not capture complete risk or a complete picture of that risk. So if someone is in or out, or they're close or they're far, it doesn't tell people how deep that flooding is going to be and what they can do to really protect themselves and empower themselves. So yes, it is a storm, it's one storm, but the other important thing that it is it's a line that tells us who pays flood insurance and who has to build a certain way if they're in that floodplain. So the final piece of our floodplain management puzzle comes together in the late 1970s with Jimmy Carter, who's dealing with an energy crisis. He's also dealing with severe inflation. The dollar just doesn't go as far. And at the same time, there's hundreds of different organizations that are responding to disasters. So this is across state lines, this is across, there's multiple organizations within a state, and that makes duplication of effort and also some duplication of costs. So Jimmy Carter's trying to make the dollar stretch further and streamline things. And he says, he takes this system from 1973, and he makes the post-disaster response federal. He says, let's put it all under a federal, let's make it federal so that we can not duplicate these efforts over streamlines. And we're gonna put all of this under one umbrella called FEMA. And FEMA exists in this state for a couple of decades up until very recently. There's some pros and cons. It does take the burden and make it federal. Some of the cons is that FEMA's billions, tens of billions of dollars in debt, primarily due to payouts from the NFIP. So that's the story so far. That's kind of how we got to where we are. Let's talk a little bit about some of the changes that are happening right now and what we are looking forward to, what we're keeping an eye on for the future. The first is flood insurance. So before the current President Trump, flood insurance was making some changes. So it used to be it's always been mandatory if you're in the 100-year floodplain in those NFIB communities. But now it was also, if you were in the floodplain, that had an impact on how much you paid per month. So it impacted your premium, but that has now been decoupled. So what that means is the line is still mandatory. If you are in the line, in the 100-year line, you pay flood insurance. But whether the amount you pay per month is now completely dependent on the amount of risk to your structure. So in you pay, out you don't, but the amount of risk directly impacts the amount you pay per month. The thing that we're seeing with flood insurance, I've heard a lot of chatter about this, or a little bit of chatter, and not much movement so far, but keeping an eye on it, is there's some talk about making flood insurance, taking it out of the NFIP, not having it federally subsidized, and turning it over to the private insurers. Pre-disaster grants. President Trump and his administration, some of the things we're seeing there is a pause on many of these pre-disaster grants. So the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, the BRIC grant has been paused. Some of the other flood hazard mitigation grants are being scrutinized and looked at for either temporary or permanent pause. That's where that's at. We'll let you know more as we find out more. The post-disaster response, I think Laura mentioned this earlier, this is looking at, there is a lot of chatter and talk about making this state, so the state would respond to disasters. We've seen this recently with the tornadoes in Arkansas, as well as Washington and California. Those states had requested a federal disaster relief and assistance and were denied. One of the things to keep in mind here is there's a proposal and some chatter, I haven't seen movement, but a proposal right now about taking the federal disaster declaration threshold and quadrupling it. So the way that threshold is determined is the number of dollars that a disaster incurs over the number of people that are impacted. That's a ratio. And the proposal is to quadruple that ratio, so 4 times the ratio, before you get federal help for a post-disaster. The building regulations, there has been some movement on this. The FFRMS and TMAC proposals, these are different building regulations to build more resilient infrastructure that can bounce back after floods. Those have been paused. There has been some movement with ASCE 24. I don't have a lot of time to go into it, but if you want to talk building codes, find me at a break or lunch. I love to talk regulation. No, I'm serious. I know it sounds like I'm joking, but I do. The last thing that we're seeing is some chatter and some movement on the shrinking or removal of FEMA altogether. So we are seeing this with a significantly reduced workforce in FEMA, as well as the reduction of some grants, programs, and divisions within FEMA itself. So it's a lot of change, and the change is a lot to process. I find it helpful, when I got here in the story, I found it helpful to just pause and say, you know, what can we control and what can't we control? And we can't control whether FEMA goes away. We can't control whether the federal government does or doesn't give us post-disaster money as a state. We can't control if flood insurance becomes private. But we can control ourselves. We can control how we prepare, how we mitigate, and how we regulate. Because change is here. It's not even coming anymore, it's just here. The climate is changing, the political landscape is changing, technology is changing at a pace faster than we can even keep up with. We're light years ahead of where we were technologically than in the 1970s when this line was even generated and created. But between all that change and how we respond is this space. And we're in that space right now. And that space is an opportunity and a choice to think about how we want to respond. And I want you to respond and to think about it. Because here's what I know. Some of the smartest people that I've ever met are in this room right now. Some of the most creative and collaborative and capable people I've ever worked with are here right now. And if anyone can solve this problem, I think it's all of us. And I want you to think about this before we have to respond. So what is best for the people and property in Colorado? Do we need a line? If we need a line, does it need to be based on a bigger storm event, like Drew was talking about with all his climate data? Or does it need to be based on some kind of risk gradation, like David's gonna mention? Or something else entirely, like a stream corridor. Jen's gonna talk about that later. How do we take everything that we know and everything that we've learned and just do better? We're part of a floodplain management story that started over 150 years ago, and it's not done yet. There is so much more to write. But right now, this is our time, and this is our chapter. So my question to you is, what do you want that chapter to say about us? And how do you want this story to end? And how can we best utilize and leverage our unique position to meet these challenges and to do what is right? And there are so many possible answers to this question, and so I'm just going to leave you with mine, and that is together. Thank you.